In this lecture, we'll explore the book of Ecclesiastes, which involves a quest for meaning. Here are three areas that we'll be exploring: the historical context, literary, and theological contexts. First, the historical context, and we'll begin with the topic of authorship. The book is entitled Kohelet, and this offers some suggestions as far as authorship. The Hebrew word itself has the notion of one who gathers together something. It's been asked, what does this person gather? Is it entitled the gatherer, Kohelet, because he collects various bits and pieces of wisdom? Or perhaps it's not the content of the book itself that's being gathered, but rather the listeners, one who gathers together people and then speaks to them. And for this reason, sometimes it's called the preacher. Michael Fox, in some of his extensive work in the book of Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, has offered a variety of translations for this: teacher, preacher, assembler, editor, assemblyman. The title Ecclesiastes derives from the Greek translation of the word appearing in the Hebrew text as Kohelet. The Greek has translated this Ecclesiastes, meaning gatherer. Pursuing then the question of authorship, it's been asked, is this Kohelet personage a real person in history, or rather a piece of figurative expression of a literary sort? Let's consider first the possibilities for Kohelet being an actual historical person. One proposal is that Kohelet is a title given to King Solomon. In favor of this is the mention in the text that the author is the son of David, a king in Jerusalem. Early Christian writers such as Gregory Thaumaturgos, a disciple of Origen, held this view, and the Jewish Targum names Solomon as the author of this book. Some hesitate to subscribe to the view that it was Solomon, paying attention to the expression in chapter 1, verse 12, where the verb tense is past, I was king. It's true that if we take this in the sense of I used to be king, but now at the point of composition no longer am king, it would be difficult to fit this into what we know of the reign of Solomon. For once he became king, he remained king until his death. Personally, I hesitate to infer this kind of meaning from the Hebrew expression, I was king. I believe it can be supported from Hebrew grammar that one could use this expression without the connotation, I am no longer king, but only used to be king in the past for a confined period. I question whether this is best understanding of the Hebrew. Some also question the Solomon authorship of this by pointing to chapter 1, verse 16. I have surpassed in wisdom everyone who ruled in Jerusalem before me. It should be pointed out that the translation that I've just given, everyone who ruled in Jerusalem before me, is from New International. Versions such as New Revised Standard are a bit closer to the Hebrew in that they leave out the verb ruled, which does not appear in the Hebrew. Therefore it would read, I have surpassed in wisdom everyone who was in Jerusalem before me. Now, persons who question the Solomonic authorship with regard to the information of verse 16 raise the point that the only ruler in Jerusalem prior to Solomon was David. Saul did not rule from Jerusalem, and even if he had, it still would have been a relatively small sampling. Only 2 kings prior to Solomon. So this is a consideration to be borne in mind when we weigh the question of authorship. Could this have been used to describe Solomon, or does it seem out of place? Tremper Longman, in his work on Ecclesiastes, points out that at times in the Middle East, ancient Near East, we have discovered autobiographies which are fictional as regards attribution of authorship. In particular, we find this in Mesopotamia, the cruciform monument of Mani Shutushu, and some others such as Agad Gupi inscription. These are autobiographies, and yet they are of a fictional sort, and at times they attribute authorship to a particular personage, knowing full well, and evidently the audience understanding full well, that it was not really written by that person, something of an honorific attribution. So the question has been raised, perhaps the hints at Solomonic authorship in Ecclesiastes are employing this same technique known elsewhere in the ancient Near East, attributing a work to someone, realizing that that was not the case. This would be related to the second bullet that you see under Solomon, pseudonymous. Is it a pseudonymous authorship situation? The last two authors is the viewpoint that observes that we have particularly an epilogue where the voice of the author changes, seems to be distinct from the content within the book itself. Let's take a look at the epilogue. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and notice at the bottom of the screen, verse 9, modern editors have inserted in italics epilogue just to serve notice that they've observed a change in voice. The word epilogue is not in the original Hebrew. Verse 9 reads, "Besides being wise, the teacher," and that is a translation for this word kohelet, "also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs. The teacher sought to find pleasing words, and he wrote words of truth plainly." We can sense that here it's presented as someone aside from the teacher reflecting on how this author composed the material contained in the bulk of the book. And that's what's meant by the proposal that there are two authors. It seems to be somewhat self-evident from the material itself. Some would attribute the initial poem, that is chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, also to this frame author, as this individual is described, leaving the balance then to be the core author or Kohelet himself. If, on the other hand, we're dealing with a figurative attribution of authorship, what would that involve? Perhaps this Kohelet reference operates somewhat like the personification of wisdom that we find in the book of Proverbs. Michael Fox, in his extensive writings, and I commend them to you, on the book of Ecclesiastes, raises this possibility. Let's turn our attention now to the historical context, beginning with the date of composition. It's observed that some of the expressions within Ecclesiastes reflect a late stage, or you might think of it as a dialect. It's not that formally different, but at least a late stage of Biblical Hebrew. It's also been observed that there are some Aramaisms, that is, expressions from a cognate language, Aramaic, which have made their way into the Hebrew found in the expression, the composition of Ecclesiastes, even a bit of Persian. And these would be features typically associated with Israel's later contact with the cultures of Mesopotamia, whether it be the Assyrian culture or the Babylonian or the Persian cultures. Now, it should be pointed out that Israel's contact with Assyria, using Aramaic, was certainly not restricted to a late period. As early as the 8th century, the northern kingdom fell to Assyria, so we have the Assyrians invading Israel. So take this with a grain of salt and be aware that these contacts are not hermetically sealed to a late period in Israelite history. One particular observation is frequent use of ani as the pronoun in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes. Some have suggested that this tendency may reflect late Hebrew. This form of the pronoun, I, does occur in earlier material. It's rather an observation of the predominance of use of this form. At the end of the day, we should be cautious in using some of these linguistic observations for firm dating. Scholars are on best ground when they conclude that this is somewhat dubious. It points in a direction, but it is not conclusive. We should also acknowledge that with any of these biblical compositions, there's the opportunity for updating, just as we in the modern world issue later versions of the Bible, and as we do so, we're accommodating changes in the language. It's conceivable that this was going on with the Hebrew Bible even at stages many centuries before the modern era. One other dimension pertaining to the historical context may be of interest to you, and that has to do not so much with the content itself, but how the believing community has responded to the content with regard to accepting it as part of the canon, the authorized collection of inspired writings. The rabbis had difficulty saying concerning Ecclesiastes, this deserves a place in the sacred collection of books. And here is why. For one, they said that Ecclesiastes opposes the Torah, and how could a book that opposes the Torah be regarded as inspired? And you may say, well, what are some of the particulars of this? In Numbers 15, we find that the Torah says, you must not prostitute yourselves going after the lusts of your own hearts and eyes. But Ecclesiastes in chapter 11 says, be happy, young men, while you are young. Let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. So we can understand the rabbis taking a close reading from Numbers 15 and Ecclesiastes 11 and saying, how can we endorse this writing? Because, at least on the surface, it seems to oppose what we find in the Torah. Further, the rabbi said, we find Ecclesiastes internally inconsistent. Here is one inconsistency that the Talmud lists. On the one hand, we find in chapter 7, verse 3 of Ecclesiastes the statement, anger is better than laughter. But then consider this from chapter 8, verse 15. Then I commended pleasure, for there is nothing better. Well, if there's nothing better than pleasure, how could anger be better than laughter? And so the rabbi said there's internal inconsistency within Ecclesiastes. They went on to say it's heretical. In the Pesichta of Rab Kahana, we read, the sages sought to store away the book of Ecclesiastes because they found in it that which tended to heresy. How then did this book achieve canonicity in spite of these difficulties? Well, here's what we understand the rabbinic position to be and how it resolved. They said, in the last analysis, this book begins with the Torah. It says in chapter 1, verse 3, regarding toil under the sun, since toil under the sun is what we must do, and this toil under the sun was understood by the rabbis to refer to study of the Torah. We may not have reached that same interpretation, but that's the interpretation that they understood. And so they said, since it advocates study the Torah, this is a good thing. And it ends with the Torah. And here they come to chapter 12 with the exhortation to revere God in view of a coming judgment. They said, well, this is consistent with the Torah. And by the way, there seems to be a connection with Solomon, and that we need to regard this with respect. So, at the end of the day, indeed it was included in the Jewish collection of canonized scripture. It's also instructive that the Qumran community included Ecclesiastes as part of sacred scripture. What about the response of the Christian community regarding the validity of Ecclesiastes' message as deserving a place in the Christian canon? In the era of Jerome, and early Christian writer, we find the allegorical hermeneutic being applied, that is, taking the content of Ecclesiastes and viewing it through an allegorical lens, and consequently making sense of it. Jerome sees the Kohelet exhortation to eat and drink, then, as being an invitation to Holy Communion, to the Eucharist, eating and drinking the commemoration of the Last Supper. Allegorical interpretation is something we're rather cautious about embracing today, but that was typical not only for understanding Christian literature, but also secular literature in the era of Jerome. And now we turn from the historical context to the literary context. We want to begin by observing that the genre we're dealing with is wisdom literature. Wisdom literature consists of maxims, that is, sayings without imperatives, and instructions, that is, sayings that contain imperatives. Here is an example. La kol zaman. There is a time for everything, appears in chapter 3. This does not issue an instruction or a command. Consequently, it earns a place as a maxim, a saying. In contrast, we find an imperative in some of the other writings of Ecclesiastes. Cast, throw, that's a command, your bread upon the waters, in chapter 11. We also find better sayings. And as you may be aware, with the better saying, typically the sage is identifying a paradox and saying one experience or one value which you would typically not have selected as something to quest after is actually of superior worth in comparison to something else. So wisdom is better than weapons of war. Who would have thought this, unless you think about it more deeply? In chapter 7, we have a collection of better sayings, one after the other. A good name is better than precious ointment. It is better to go to the house of mourning. Sorrow is better than laughter. We also find blessed sayings, and these are using the expression ashrei, which means having supreme worth. Blessed are you, O land, whose king is of noble birth, as opposed to a king who arises from some other sector of society. We also find eyewitness accounts, quite a few actually, some 22 within Ecclesiastes. These also occur in the collection of Proverbs from time to time, but here in Ecclesiastes they're particularly dominant. Notice the kinds of things that Kohelet observes. As to literary devices, there is a good range of devices that are presented within Kohelet. A few that we'll notice here are assonance and chiasm, synonymous parallelism, and antithetical parallelism. We see an example of assonance and chiasm occurring in chapter 7, verse 1, the first half of the verse. Tov shem mi shemen tov. Notice that we have the word tov, meaning good, repeated at the front and the back. And then we have this sound shem, comparing to shem. Shem is name, and then shemen, in the compound mi shemen, means perfume. Assonance, repeated sound. Chiasm, the fact that this is inverted. So tov shem then is reversed, shem tov, just extracting the repeated parts. Synonymous parallelism can be seen in this example from chapter 10, verse 18. Notice the color-coded words which are similar. If a man is lazy, rafters sag. If his hands are idle, the house leaks. Antithetical parallelism can be observed in chapter 10, verse 12. Notice the lines connecting contrasting concepts. Words from a wise man's mouth are gracious, but a fool is consumed by his own lips. We noticed a bit ago that various readers have recognized paradoxes within Ecclesiastes. The rabbis went so far as to question whether this book should be included within sacred canon because of internal inconsistencies. I'm increasingly convinced that these inconsistencies are there to make us pay attention. They're designed to make us look more closely. They're designed to make us uncomfortable. And they may point to a literary device that is operating with a very significant degree of power, that is to say, a dialogue. Now, admittedly, we do not have two obvious speakers named. The notion of interplay or moving back and forth between different voices is something we see more explicitly in the Song of Solomon. But here, it may be at work as well, and it may be that the author assumed that as we encountered the paradoxes, we would find ourselves searching for an explanation and wind up with the solution, namely, this represents two varying viewpoints that are in dialogue. So consider, for example, from chapter 1, verse 13, this may be rendered the idea that God has laid a heavy burden on humankind. So there's the view of God portrayed as someone who is making life difficult for us. But notice chapter 3, verse 13. We find that it is a gift from God when we are able to eat, drink, and find some reward in our work. Can we have it both ways? I would propose that we have here, in essence, a conversation between one person who has a highly pessimistic view of God and then someone else who comes along and says, well, let me poke some holes in your theory. What did you have for dinner last night? Did you enjoy it? And I understand you enjoy the work you do. Don't you realize this is coming from God? How can you both disregard God as someone who is only making life difficult and at the same time enjoy those features? For they are empirical evidence that not all in life is bad, and I'm here to tell you God is the one behind that enjoyment. This is just one example of various paradoxes within Ecclesiastes that become fascinating when we view them as a point and counterpoint dialogue or debate. Incidentally, it's my conviction that Kohelet is offering to us a model for engaging an unbelieving community. And this is particularly pertinent today in a postmodern era. Consider using Ecclesiastes as your mentor for how to engage people who feel that faith is not a valuable component, or at least faith as portrayed by the Christian scriptures. From historical context, literary context, now let's go to the theological context. There are 5 dimensions worth considering with regard to the theological context or insights offered by Ecclesiastes. First, meaning in life. Second, the worth of wisdom. Third, disappointment and despair. Fourth, time and eternity. And finally, the nature of God as revealed in Ecclesiastes or Kohelet. First, consider the meaning of life as presented within Kohelet. You will have noticed by now that in chapter 2 there are various regions of inquiry that Kohelet engages, making various forays or experiments in order to find out what's worthwhile in life. The results that we find coming from approximately verses 11 through 14 in chapter 2 are observations such as these. Simply to accumulate material enjoyments is useless. This is chasing after the wind. It's elusive. Wisdom, he says, does have some value, but it is limited in its value. And so he concludes from this search for meaning in life, particularly chapter 2, don't be tricked into thinking that materialism is the ultimate goal because materialism is deceptive. There's a principle that would be worth sharing with believers and non-believers alike in our current era, isn't it? And then he counsels, enjoy the trip, not just the destination. The second area that we'll consider is the worth of wisdom as presented in Ecclesiastes. Passages such as verse 8 of chapter 6 poses the question, what advantage has a wise man over a fool? What is the worth of wisdom? What's the point of being wise? Some of the benefits appear in places such as chapter 2, verse 13, where Kohelet says, if you are wise, you have access to some light. You're able to see where you are going, and that's beneficial. Chapter 7, verse 12, if you are wise, you have a degree of shelter. And also in chapter 7, verse 19, and chapter 9, verses 16 and 18, he recognizes that if you have a grip on wisdom, you have a grip on a degree of power. So there are some advantages to wisdom. But on the other hand, there are some limitations too. Wisdom is not a cure-all. And this is part of the reason that Ecclesiastes earns a place among wisdom literature as skeptical wisdom. It protests the simplistic notion that doing the right thing always brings, fairly directly, some good benefits. It says that doesn't always happen in the short haul. So, for example, chapter 7, verse 24, one of the limitations of wisdom is that it's elusive. It's hard to track down. Chapter 11, verse 6 says, even amassing all our powers of wisdom, it's difficult to know which investment will be fruitful. Chapter 9, verse 12, it's hard to know when and where disaster may strike. And chapter 2, verse 16, being wise does not exempt you from death. And finally, chapter 11, verse 5, being wise does not give you total insight into what God is doing. Sometimes what he does baffles even the most wise. So wisdom has value, but it has limitations as well. Thirdly, let's look at the topic of disappointment and despair in Kohelet. Here we're turning particularly to chapter 9, initially chapter 9, verses 13 to 16, where we find this poignant anecdote where there was a siege against a small town. And within that small town, a wise man who was poor in the socioeconomic scale, yet his wisdom was significant enough that it rescued the town from the siege. And so comes forth the wise saying, the observation extrapolated from this experience, wisdom is superior to strength. But then comes the flavor of disappointment. After a period of time, that poor wise man was forgotten. Disappointment and despair also find expression with regard to resources. Wealth, a resource, can suddenly be lost. Chapter 5, verses 13 to 15. Justice may languish, another cause for disappointment. And we find in chapter 3, verse 16, there are times when wickedness masquerades in the robes of a judge. Or chapter 4, beginning with verse 1, there are times when the poor are oppressed. This is unjust. So we find disappointment in the halls of justice. Thirdly, there's disappointment because there are times when sorrow actually has the upper hand. Sorrow is better than laughter, says the sober view and slightly pessimistic view of chapter 7, verse 3. Disappointment and despair are heard in the acknowledgement of chapter 7, verse 1. The day of death is better than the day of birth. So we might extrapolate from this, death prevails. And the next verse, chapter 7, verse 2, death is the destiny of everyone. Despite disappointments and the theme of despair, we notice in chapter 8, verse 12, despite the success of the wicked, it is better to live with a high regard of reverence towards God. So one's view of God should not be poisoned by the awareness that life has a certain degree of disappointment and despair. Another important theme, as we continue our overview of the theological messages within Kohelet, has to do with the topic of time and eternity. So we find sayings such as this in chapter 8, verse 5. Wisdom consists of this, knowing the appropriate times. Being in sync with times, not simply knowing a proper action, but knowing when to execute it, knowing what's going on. An illustration of this would be in chapter 10, verse 16. A wise ruler demonstrates wisdom in this. He knows when it's time to party and when it's time not to party. So he is wise. The sage, next, concerning time and eternity, acknowledges that it's inscrutable. There are things that we just cannot know about the future. Chapter 6, verse 12, chapter 10, verse 14 make this clear. And regarding eternity, or the end of one's physical time of life, the sage is very candid in acknowledging all die. No one has power over the day of one's death. Chapter 8, verse 8. One of the most poignant comments about eternity, I find, is lodged here in chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 11. And here I'm reading from New International Version. He, that is God, has made everything beautiful in its time. Notice the reference to time. And now this. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men. So things are beautiful in their time, but that's not the end of it. There is some divine embedding of eternity within the hearts of humankind. NIV translates the remainder of chapter 11 thus, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I suspect this may better be translated, and I'll back up a bit. God has set eternity within the hearts of humankind, without which they cannot understand what God has done from beginning to end. Without which, that is, without an eternal perspective, humans cannot grasp the full range of God's meaningful actions. Some of God's actions will not make sense until viewed from an eternal perspective. I believe that may be what's being conveyed here. A fairly, in fact, an extremely profound insight on the importance of eternity for living a meaningful life in the now. Finally, under theological context, insights regarding God as portrayed by Kohelet. Here are some aspects of God that are presented within Kohelet. God is portrayed as creator. We've seen this elsewhere in wisdom literature as the dominant view of God. There's the acknowledgement that what God does, his actions, are inscrutable. They are beyond knowing. Both good times and bad are controlled by God. He is even the maker of them, and each has an appropriate place within the broader scope of time. God is the one, as we've seen just shortly prior, who instills eternity within humankind. Continuing, God is one deserving of reverence. God is the one who is the ultimate arbiter of the worth of what we do. We might ask this question: what time frame does Kohelet have in mind for God's arbitration or his judging, his evaluating? Is it now, or does he have in mind eternity? And finally this: the enjoyments that we do experience in life, these too come from God. We'll close by observing some advice that Kohelet issues and then translate some of these into application. Kohelet advises us to put a premium on obtaining wisdom, even though it has limitations. He encourages us to value working with others. Partnership is important. And here is this notion of enjoy the journey, not just the destination. And there are various places where Kohelet says, admittedly, life is a bumpy road. Let's not try to sugarcoat this or pretend it's not so. And above all, and notice chapter 12, the last chapter of the book, is one of the places where Kohelet stops and says something very important to do is properly elevate God as supremely valuable in your life, that worthy of reverence. Some of these then will convert to applications which I've listed here, and certainly this is not an exhaustive list. These are depicted in the heading as applications relevant for the ancient audience, and they quite easily convert to the modern audience as well. Kohelet encourages us to look ahead to the conclusion of life and be prepared. Live life with the end in view. Related to this, we should evaluate things in their temporal, their modern, their contemporary significance from an eternal perspective. We should be realistic. There are some issues in life that we cannot fix. At the same time, our preoccupation with problems should not prevent us from enjoying small pleasures, a worthwhile job, an encouraging marriage, a meal that smells good and tastes good. We should take care to revere God and not wait till the end of life to begin doing so. Related to the joy in small pleasures is this: regarding material delights, yes, enjoy them, but evaluate them, for if that's all you've got, you're an unfortunate person because they will evaporate. We might summarize it in this way: there has got to be more to life than life, that is, temporal life of an earthly existence as we know it. This is a haunting message coming through Ecclesiastes. Finally, as suggested earlier, I would encourage you to explore Ecclesiastes as a dialogue, as it were, a debate between someone who is pessimistic about life and blames God for the difficulties, and someone who candidly acknowledges the difficulties in life but is still hanging on to God and hopes that his or her friend will come to see God as an ally, an asset, and not simply someone to blame and abandon. I believe this book can be immensely instructive for discussions with people who are not yet followers of the Messiah in the current postmodern era.